ensuring that the special operators had Blue Force tracking devices, which is a way for space-based assets to determine where troop movement is actually happening. And so my job was ensuring that special operators had space-based Blue Force trackers on them. So in case they got into trouble, we could quickly deploy a quick response force to get them if they got in any kind of trouble. So that was probably the highlight of my career in terms of really helping out and showing how critical space was in support of operations. And after that, like I said, instructed at weapons school, then went to the schools that you go to as you progress through your career, and then culminated really working with General Saltzman, one-star General Saltzman at the time, because the Chief of Staff of the Air Force asked him to look at multi-domain command and control, or MDC2 is what it was called in the Air Force. And so it was very interesting, again, really trying to research and help the team research what it means to have multi-domain operations, and again, how critical space was in support of multi-domain operations. And again, what we're seeing with the establishment of the Space Force is the importance of space to gain and maintain space superiority and the need for support from the other domains. So I kind of a lengthy, a lengthy response, but I just wanted to go through, I think, what were some of the highlights as it relates to where we're at today.
Yeah, that's a boy. I got a million questions of that. Let me ask a couple more background questions, because I'd love to get into some policy and strategy, which is kind of where that conversation is going. But so high school sweethearts. I mean, that's awesome. But the Air Force. So not private sector, not the Marines, not the Army, the Air Force. Why is that?
Yeah, it's funny. I was going to school at Northern Arizona University. I was getting my degree in math education. And I remember thinking I didn't want to be a math teacher right away. I just knew that. I mean, that was my where I was going. I was going to be a math teacher. And I remember and I was a resident assistant at one of my in the dormitory I was living in. And all that means is the RA kind of walks around to make sure all the kids are doing what they're supposed to, or not doing what they're not supposed to. And so a fellow RA of mine came up to me and he said, "Hey, have you ever thought about joining the Air Force?" And I said, "No, I hadn't." He goes, "Would you like to get your master's degree paid for?" And I said, "That sounds pretty good." And from a teacher's perspective, yes, you want to get your master's degree as quickly as possible. And he said, what do you think about working 8 days a month?" And I said, "That's compelling. I like where you're saying. You're saying I can get my master's degree paid for and I only have to work 8 days a month." I said, "Sign me up." And so he convinced me to sign up for Air Force ROTC. And it was 2 years into my education. And so I had 2 years to really, knock ROTC, get that accomplished, which all that meant is it accelerated my class load so that I could get into the Air Force. And at the time, it was 94 when I graduated, and they had just drawn down all of the pilots after Desert Storm. And so it was the smallest group of pilots entering the Air Force at the time. And I think there was 100 across all ROTC to take the detachments nationwide and the Air Force Academy. And so, of course, all of us, when we joined the Air Force, we put pilot, navigator, non-rated operations. And so they gave me non-rated operations because I think I was fifth in line. Even though for that year, we had the #1 detachment in the nation, there was, several other people ahead of me to get pilot slots. So needless to say, I was happy and honored to get a non-rated operations position as a missile launch officer. But that's how the career started to get in. Was someone just approached me and said, "What do you think about these things?" And I said, "That sounds good." And then what I thought is, I was just going to join for 4 years. I didn't know what I wanted to do, so I figured it would be a good opportunity for 4 years. And then 24 years later, retired. But it was because of the relationships that you develop in the military, and that's why I kept going, is the friendships and camaraderie that was developed in that first duty assignment.
Yeah, so that's interesting to hear that, because I've got one of my kids is in the Air Force, and coming up on the first 4 years. So So it was really the friendships, the people you knew, that's what kept you in.
Yeah, and look at, like I said, you've got, I mean, I could go through a whole list of folks, General Saltzman, Joker Jackson, Cujo Jones. I mean, there's so many folks that I met at Malmstrom that are still involved in, help stand up the Space Force and now are in space industry. And so it's great to just watch their respective careers, but I'm still friends with all of them.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right, so we got to know hippie. What's the story?
Okay, I think it's a funny story. Uh, Kind of self-identified because I actually, it was at the 4th Space Surveillance Squadron. I was a captain, and I had a 69 VW bug. Is a short answer to the story. And there's a longer version, but I'm not going to bore the audience with that long version. But the fact is, as a joke, some of the squadron mates, when I was on leave, they painted my car, which was that 69 VW bug, in all different colors. So every quarter panel was a different color, and then they painted huge daisies all over that thing. And I drove it. I just drove it around. On the driver's side door, it said "Make Love Not War." Above the windshield, it said "Bill Plestina," my wife's name, and then across the back, it said "Free Tibet," which all I thought was hysterical. And so I drove that around, and I drove it to weapons school at the end of 2001. And it was funny, of course, until 9/11 happened. And we all know what happened on 9/11 in 2001. But that's where hippie came from, is that 69 VW bug.
Nice.
And my easygoing personality, Bruce, is what I would say. But
You know what? You do have an easygoing personality. I was imagining like long hair at one time in your life, but I guess that's not the case.
Unfortunately not.
Oh, okay. Good. Hey, so that kind of brings us up a little bit to the present. So I'd love to dive into the history of the Space Force Association. So you are the founder, the founding member. It was you and you at the beginning, and I know that that's no small feat to grow something from nothing. So take us through the history of the Space Force Association, how to get started. I think the why is pretty clear. When you have a Space Force, you want to have a Space Force Association. But how did all that start in the beginning?
Yeah, at the beginning, I tell you, I was frustrated as a senior space officer retiring from the Air Force and going into industry. And I just had this observation that industry really didn't know how to receive senior space officers. That was one of the issues. And so I started thinking, what would be really cool is if we created an education program to educate industry on what to expect when senior space leaders retired from the military, specifically with regard to the space mission sector. And so I was talking to some folks about that, and I said, what would be great is if there was an organization solely dedicated to space professionals. And at the time, and of course, friends, as friends will do, they'll say, hey, that's a great idea, you should do that. And so it was basically a challenge. Someone challenged me to say, I bet you can't do that. And I said, well, I think I can. And sometimes ignorance is bliss, and this is one of those times. And so I created the Association of Space Professionals, was the first iteration of it. And very soon after it got going, I was approached by some folks, and they said you should change that name to the Space Force Association. And so a couple months later, and it was October 2019, 2 months before the Space Force stood up. And then as soon as the Space Force stood up, some advisors said you should change that name. And so I changed it to the Space Force Association. And quite honestly, at the time, I remember the conversation vividly. I was talking to my brother, who's also a good friend, and I said, John, here's what I'm thinking about doing. And I think, we'll have some T-shirts and maybe some lapel pins. And he goes, I don't think you realize what you're doing right now, because what you're doing is much bigger than T-shirts and lapel pins. And at the time, I was kind of looking at it like, what are you thinking about? Why would you think that? But now in hindsight, yeah, he was 100% accurate. This is a large undertaking, and thank God that we got a lot of good volunteers that started to see the vision and understand it, and then want to learn more about the space domain. And so really the whole momentum that's created with this organization is because of the tremendous volunteer support that we have at SFA. And so, yeah, initially it was ignorance, and then very shortly thereafter it was volunteers. And then as soon as you get volunteers, you get people supportive of the mission, everything else starts to fall into place. So here we are about 4.5 years later, and we're having a live radio broadcast with a volunteer of yourself, Bruce, that's helping do this. So no, it's been quite the journey, but that's how it started. It's t-shirts and lapel pins.
Yeah, that's I love those stories. I mean, that's, and I'm not sure, Bill, that I know I've not heard that story before, so I'm guessing it may not be out there in any great detail. Um, so tell me a little bit about, so when you started, and it kind of evolved, and you had some some friends and associates kind of guide you into kind of like the bigger picture of things, but you clearly have a vision for the Space Force Association. I'm a recipient of that vision. I think a lot of people are, but tell us how that vision, number one, what is it? What is the vision for the Space Force Association as you see it? And then how did that evolve from, the very beginnings to where it is today?
Well, again, yeah, thanks, Bruce. It's one of those things where you don't know where it's going to go, and quite honestly, the whole objective, we can go into the three major functions that we accomplish, but the objective is to create a platform, and that's what the Space Force Association is. It's a platform to see what can springboard from it. And if you just allow yourself to be open to any and all opportunities, focus on those good opportunities, then you'd be surprised at what's going to happen. And so that's really what I wanted to do is keep the expectation to have a platform that anybody could get involved, and based on where that energy was going, we could pivot to follow that energy. So a couple of the big things that I knew had to get going right away is educating Congress and educating our policymakers. So one of our first volunteers, Ling Eric Sunby, who executed or was our executive director for several years, he said, what do you need help with? I said, Eric, what we need, and he told me that he had some background in policy. I said, what we need is a Space Force caucus. And so he worked diligently to meet with members of the Senate and the House and talk about the establishment of Space Force caucus. And so very quickly, early on in our establishment, is we helped create the Space Force caucus in the House and the Senate. And I'm really excited to start to host what we're calling Space Power Breakfasts on the Hill, and our first one is next Tuesday. So we're going to be on the Hill, educating members of Congress and bringing in guest speakers. And next week we're going to have Major General Gagnon, who is the U.S. Space Force's S2, provide an unclassified threat briefing to members of Congress. So policy is one of those main things I knew we had to do. The other is capturing the stories from what other tacticians, space tacticians, grew up with in the Air Force. And so we started the Space Warfighter Talks and the Space Innovation Talks. And Space Warfighter Talks are a way for Space Force members to tell their story. And SFA Space Warfighter Talks are that. So you can go over to our YouTube channel, where we've got over 75 interviews that have been accomplished over the last 4 years, where Space Force leaders get to tell their story and talk about what's important to them. Space Innovation Talks is a way for industry to get involved and tell us about how they're innovating to help the Space Force do its job. So we have Space Innovation Talks. And then I'm really excited about the U.S. Space Force's Delta 7. That press release just went out this week, and I'm already getting contacted by folks. And that's a TV series. It's a made-for-TV drama series that walks through what is in the art of the possible for a future Space Force. It's not our current Space Force, but it's a future Space Force that, with the appropriate policies and with the appropriate capabilities, we can actually examine what the Space Force is really capable of. I tell you, the hardest part about telling the Space Force's story is describing the impact that we would have on this, in this nation, our partners and allies, if we didn't have space superiority here. And so that TV series starts to tell that story and follows some young guardians around as they interact with their operational environment, with the acquisition community, with the intelligence community, and really helps start to tell that story. So those are, the education piece, the informing piece. But then Global Space University, I was frustrated because when I graduated or when I retired, I remember, people started talking about the Space Force, and they never spent any time sitting on Space Console. They never spent any time, in the Space Mission Set. And so I said, what if we had a university that helped certify space professionals? So that birthed Global Space University. And again, here's another great volunteer, Danielle Storen, who is our chief financial officer. She's also the CEO of Integrity ISR, which already had programs in place to help out. She goes, hey, what if we partner and we create GSU? And so that's how GSU was started. Over 400 certified space professionals since its inception have been created. And now we can actually look at who is a space professional. And so, I consider myself a certified space professional, but now after going through GSU, I'm a certified space professional in retirement. And so I'm really, really excited about that. And then how do we get after the next generation? So we partner with the Space Force Cadet Corps, which is focused on K through 12 and getting young kids excited about space. And as young kids, the question becomes, how do they start their space careers? Well, let's get them excited about space and offer them an opportunity, while at the same time educating them about the Space Force and the implications of national security space. And then Space Professional Society is a brand new program that we started here at SFA that focuses on the university age kids who want to start their space careers. And then in the future, what we're going to do is we're going to connect those Space Professional Society kids to industry to help them create their, the best career track that they could have. So, I mean, I went over a bunch of programs there, and of course, as Rhonda mentioned at the intro, Space Power Conference. Really excited about that. I'm sure we're going to talk about that more, but that's kind of a quick overview of some of the main programs that SFA is working on.
Yeah, I love it. That's awesome stuff. And I actually I noted on the website, research, inform, advocate. That is the purpose that you've laid out for SFA, and in the form of influencing policy on the Hill, a whole host of programs that people can get involved in no matter what their interest is in space. That's tremendous. And then basically advocating. Now, one minor question. So the logo, there's always a story about the logo. How'd the logo come about?
I mean, I got a lot of feedback on the initial logo, because I went to Logo Creator and I typed in, I think I typed in Delta, and so it spit out a Delta, which of course looked like Star Trek, and that was before the Space Force had come up with its logo. So I took a lot of the hits initially in saying, hey, why do you have a Delta for a logo? And I said, well, I mean, it just makes the most amount of sense. And so we had to create the Delta. So the initial one, which is, I'm wearing the sweatshirt here. It's got the kind of the Delta for the A. And that's how it started, was we created SFA with an orbit. We need an orbit around it. And so that's how that logo came in. And of course, what happens is you have volunteers that step up and they say, hey, I can probably do something with that logo. And so we had a volunteer from the Army that actually stepped up and said, hey, I want to recreate your logo. And so they created the logo you see today, which is the orbit. They rounded out the Delta, quote unquote, the nose cone, if you will, for the Alpha, or for the A and the association. And then they incorporated the orbit into the three letters, which I thought was really compelling. So that's a logo you see today. But yeah, as you know, Bruce, what I do is if folks have ideas or if they got things that they want to do, I say, yeah, go do that. And then typically we take a look at it, after a bit, and we make a decision, and we execute, and we move pretty fast.
Yeah, and that is one of the great things about your leadership in this organization, is that unlike in the private sector or even in the public sector where things are fairly structured, you can embrace, all kinds of ideas, try them on, see what fits, see what doesn't, all that kind of. That's what makes it fun. I did get it. So as you know, Bill, I did solicit questions from the team, and some of them are detailed and deep. And I purposely didn't do it so you'd have a lot of advance warning. You saw some of them, but I did just get one that came in from Danielle, our CFO, and she thought I should ask you about your Hollywood consulting. And I was wondering what that was all about.
Yeah, that's that Space Force Delta 7. So That's actually a great story because it was on my 50th birthday. We had gotten invited. I say we, Matt Anderson, the chief growth officer for SFA, and myself and his family actually got invited down to the Inspiration 4 launch that Jared Isaacman and the Inspiration 4 crew went up on the first commercial, commercial flight to space flight to orbit the Earth for 3 days. So we got invited down there, and as I do whenever I go to a place like that, I'll walk through the hotel lobby just to see who's there because there was a lot of people that were traveling down to Patrick to watch this launch. And as I was walking around the hotel lobby, I just happened to sit down at the bar for a second, and there was a guy, a gentleman, and his son was sitting next to me, and I just asked him, "Hey, what do you do?" And he told me, he's just out here for the launch, and his son kind of got him access to this launch, and so they're really excited. His son had gone to, he had started getting interested in space a long time ago, so he went to space camp down in Alabama. And so I started getting the story, and anyways, they disappeared, and they came back, and he said, "Hey, I'm really hungry. Unfortunately, the kitchen had just closed down, and I try to carry some money, some cash with me, even though we don't typically do that anymore. I carry some cash with me, and I asked the bartender, I said, "Hey, what would it take to get the kitchen opened again?" I said, "Would $100 do it?" And she goes, "Yeah, I think so." And so the cook came out. I said, "Hey, would this $100 buy a couple of burgers? Because my friends who just came up to the bar are hungry." And he goes, "How would you like them cooked?" And so he went back, made 3 hamburgers for me and George and his son. And so George Page is who I was giving a burger to. He just happened to be a producer in Hollywood. And he said, "Hey, you know what? We could probably tell a story or help tell a story." And that started, again, 3 years ago. And he said, "Let me introduce you to some writers." And so he introduced me to Gar and Judy Rees-Stevens, and they're, Emmy-nominated writers. And they've written for Star Trek. They've written for, a lot of phenomenal TV shows. And so they started asking me questions about, "Hey, can you ask us, or can you tell us more about how the Space Force operates?" And I said, "I can try." And so we started having just a dialogue about, "Hey, what about this storyline, and what about that storyline?" And that was really exciting for me, because again, telling the Space Force story is so critical. If you compare what the Space Force is doing standing by new service in today's technology, with the last time a service stood up back in 1946, after demonstrating capability in World War II, visually being able to see the impact to air dominance, and then trying to explain to folks the criticality of the Space Force, based on satellites that they can't see that are orbiting Earth right now, that's a tough story to tell. And you can't visualize the impact. And so what we've got to do is figure out better ways to visualize an impact. And that's what Gar and Judy Rees-Stevens are doing. They're creating this narrative that's extremely exciting. And so they're currently shopping that around Hollywood right now to see if the studio will pick it up. And then we'll be off the races in terms of getting to production. So that's what we're trying to get to now is, how can SFA help be a consultancy for Hollywood? Because right now the Space Force is completely undermanned. There's no way we can steal folks away from the Space Force to help tell stories. We need them operating and doing their job. So my recommendation is let's use SFA to help, because SFA is full of a lot of space professionals that can help tell stories and help create content for Hollywood. So yeah, there's a lot going on there. In fact, we got another treatment that's being put together to celebrate the 100 years of spaceflight. And we'd like to see that documentary get created between now and probably next March, so that we can actually talk about and celebrate the fact that we've had 100 years of spaceflight. So there's a lot going on, and yeah, that's a fun component and one I'm going to focus a lot of attention on.
Yeah, that's super exciting, Bill. I don't think I knew all those details. That's very exciting. Hey, along with that, some of the questions, some of the more serious questions that the team asked, this kind of fits right in with what you're saying, talking about policy strategy, kind of the industry, space power. So what are your thoughts on kind of the space domain and, what kind of future, conflicts, how that the space domain is going to shape those or reshape those, and what kinds of things you know, do we need to be thinking about, just kind of the larger we as a country and other countries as well. What's your take on all of that?
Thanks. That's a loaded question. It's probably going to take. I mean, we could spend an hour just talking about that question. But let me sum it up this way: is first of all, as the Space Force or national security space relates to the other sectors in the space domain. Let's talk about that for a second. And what I like to do is talk about inverse pyramid. And the larger the base is, or the larger the portion of the pyramid is, the more resources we're dedicating to that sector. So, for example, the commercial sector right now is at the base of the pyramid. A lot of resources going into the commercial sector right now, and it's because it should be, quite honestly, because the future space economy is going to be over $1 trillion, in the very near future. And so we need to be investing a lot of dollars into the commercial industry because that's providing a lot of capability. In fact, I'm talking to you right now via Starlink. So that just demonstrates, the criticality of space and getting information relayed around the globe. And then if you look at the civil sector, you start talking about discovery and what we're doing in the civil sector. That's really interesting as well, because NASA's doing a lot of work. And quite honestly, even the private sector is doing a lot in terms of discovery, as Jared Isaacman just again demonstrated in the first civilian spacewalk in space, which, by the way, Jared has confirmed he's going to be at Space Power Conference 2024, so we're really looking forward to hosting him again this year. He was at last year talking about Inspiration 4 and even talking about his Polaris Dawn mission that he just executed. But underpinning all of that, and at the point of the pyramid, is the Space Force, meaning if the Space Force doesn't do its job or doesn't have the resources to do its job, that entire inverse pyramid falls over. Commercial can forget about having access to space. The civil sector can forget about having access to space because it's not a protected domain. Just like the maritime, the Navy does in the maritime domain, it ensures freedom of action for trades or for goods and services. So we need the same in the space domain. That's what the Space Force is all about, is ensuring that freedom of action. No one wants a war that starts or extends into space, but we must be ready in case the adversary wants to test our resolve with regard to ensuring freedom of action in the space domain. So I just use that analogy, just to talk about the criticality of the Space Force. Now, what does that mean for the future? And hopefully what that does is it sets us up for the future conversation, which is we need to ensure the Space Force has the resources and capabilities to do its job. Congress gave them a pretty big mandate to ensure freedom of action in the space domain, but they didn't give them any of the resources. And so now we must start talking about right-sizing the Space Force in terms of, do they have the numbers of people that they need? Do they have the capabilities that they need? I think probably the biggest, a nightmare situation that I could only think about is the Space Force budget being unexecuted by $2 billion. And that's a nightmare scenario. But that's something that could happen if the resources aren't there to ensure the budgetary allotment in the NDAA that's been provided isn't going to the Space Force. So the future is, I think we're going to see the Space Force grow considerably. It's going to need to grow. And quite honestly, the other services are going to they're going to figure out how much they rely on the Space Force, and that conversation is going to have to continue to evolve. Going all the way back to the multi-domain command and control discussions that we've had, which, I'm going to pause here for a second and just see if there's any follow-up questions or thoughts about that.
No, I think, gosh. I think the key thing from my perspective, Bill, is what you said about there being the space domain and keeping it free for action, for commerce, for freedom of passage, that kind of thing, and talking about the the huge job that the Space Force has compared with the number of people in the Space Force. And I think compared to the budget as well. Um, I like the fact that you mentioned that industry is, a lot of resources being focused on industry. And I'm assuming that you're talking in the context of space. So is that, so it's like, hey, we've got a lot of resources being focused on industry around space right now, but maybe there's not as much that's going into the Space Force budget at this point. Um, yeah, I tell you what I'd like to ask, and I just will. So, future conflicts. I mean, how do things line up around the world? We have spacefaring nations, the United States. We've got some other spacefaring nations. So, what does it mean to keep the space domain clear? What does that look like?
Yeah, that's going to require a partnership, which, by the way, our Space Power Conference is Together Above, which really discusses the criticality of partnering with industry and with our allied countries, allies and partners around the globe, international partners. But that's what it's going to come down to. I remember, and this is a great opportunity to tell war stories, but I remember sitting in a international summit hosted by, at the time, Steve Katay, who was the Undersecretary of Defense for Space Policy. And I was invited over there as just, sitting in the back row, the nosebleeds, if you will. And I remember the partner countries sitting around the table, and they were asking for clarity on what the U.S. needed as a leader in this domain to cover down and close the gaps on some of its capability needs. And so what I heard, and this is only my interpretation, what I heard them saying is, hey, our budgets are even more limited than yours. So we would like to focus our national security space budgets on closing capability gaps that you would like us to cover down on. So I just see that as, that might still be a issue that's ongoing, is what are the capability gaps that are there, and how can our international partners ensure that those are covered from a national perspective, but also, going back to the CASR concept of commercially augmented space reserve. So, what is that going to look like if the Space Force turns to the private sector, the commercial sector, and says, hey, can you help us cover down on space superiority needs? Similar to what's being done a lot with SpaceX and Starlink. So that's what the future looks like. It's not anything that we've seen in the past, where it's a very fine line, or it's a very discrete line between what's happening between the military capabilities and the commercial capabilities. I think we're going to see that line blur considerably, especially because we need all the capabilities we need at the exact time we need them to ensure freedom of action in the domain.
Yeah, absolutely. Bill, this is a huge topic, and I wonder if we could maybe have you come back and dive into that specifically a little bit more, because I'd love to ask you a bunch more questions about that.
Yeah, you bet.
Perfect. Hey, so I want to get to the Space Power Conference. So you talked a lot about all the programs that are happening with SFA, and I will just highlight to the audience too, by the way, all that stuff you can find on the website, which we're very proud of. It's a great website. It's ussfa.org. So encourage you to check it out. And I'll give one brief commercial too. You can get some SFA swag there too. We just opened up an SFA store. And if you want to get some FSA swag, you can grab it. But let's talk about space power. We got about 8 or 9 minutes left here. So the Space Power Conference. This is conference number 2. I just by happenstance attended conference number 1. I thought it was awesome. That's honestly what got me involved. I reached out and said, hey, you need some help? And I was thinking, move tables and chairs at the next conference, but there's a little more help that was needed, so I dove in. But tell us about the Space Power Conference. Who attends, who can attend, who's going to be speaking, what you expect to happen, what kinds of things come out of it. Just to give us the full rundown.
Yeah, it's tough to give you the full rundown here in just a few minutes, but let me do my best. So Space Power came into existence because there wasn't a conference solely dedicated to U.S. Space Force Guardians and their families. There were a lot of other conferences out there, but none were focused on the Space Force's mission set specifically. So obviously, as an advocacy group for a strong U.S. Space Force, it made sense for us to host a conference And so I remember going to the board of directors last year and saying, hey, we have to do this, and I'd like your support. And they supported, and they said, hey, we'll see where this can go. And thank God that we pulled off a miracle, which is executing a conference in about 4 months. And for those out there who understand how conferences execute, they know that pulling off a conference in 4 months is no small feat. For those of you who don't know how conferences execute, just know that behind the scenes, there is a tremendous group of volunteers and team that are really trying to make that work. And so Space Power Conference is all about space power. Hell, space power is still, people are like, hey, is it one word? Is it 2 words? And so doctrinally, it's one word. Space power is one word, and that is, how do we achieve freedom of action in the space domain by utilizing space power. So that's what the Space Force does, and that made sense then to call it space power. And then what happened is we said, hey, Guardians, you're invited to this as a kind of a professional development event, and we'd love for you to attend this. And so we had over 600 Guardians in attendance. And I remember when the CSO came out, General Saltzman, he looked across the stage or across the audience, and he's like, I've never seen this many Guardians in one place at one time. So that in and of itself is a service, and that is bringing Guardians together, and then having industry there, being able to have access to Guardians to better understand their needs. That's what it's all about. Is now this year we're bringing in academia, we're bringing in international partners, we're bringing in more folks to really talk about how they can help with the space power needs and what their contribution can be to achieving space superiority. And so we expect it to be around 3,000, 3,500 attendees down in Orlando, 10th, 11th, and 12th, if your calendar permits. I'd invite anyone who's interested in learning more about Space Force and space power and the Space Force Association to think about attending. And if you haven't already thought about attending, or if you've already thought about attending, maybe thinking about sponsoring, to make sure that we can continue this mission that we're doing, which is to help research, inform, and advocate for a strong U.S. Space Force.
Yeah, that's amazing. And you've got some we've got some interesting activities around that as well, right?
Oh yeah. I'm sorry. Yes. So we've got the golf tournament that's happening on the 9th. We have our national convention that's happening on the 9th. We have the 10th, 11th, and 12th, which is the conference itself. We have a Space Force birthday gala where we hand out awards on the 11th in the evening, and then there's the T-minus 10 miler run that's happening down at Patrick Space Force Base. Who's showing up? You asked that question. Yeah, so General Saltzman's showing up again this year. He's looking forward to another great event. General Whiting, the commander of U.S. Space Command, is showing up. We have the industry CEO showing up, as mentioned. Jared Isaacman is showing up from the Polaris Dawn mission, first civilian spacewalk. So he's going to talk about that experience. We're really looking forward to that. It's going to be another, Chief Master Sergeant of the Space Force is going to be there, Chief Pennsylvania. We're actually working with some of the chiefs to create a panel of young Guardians. So folks who some folks are referring to OGs, original Guardians. They've not been any other service. They've only been Space Force service members. So we're going to hear from them. Another really exciting agenda, and again, Lena Cash and her team of tremendous volunteers have been putting together another phenomenal agenda everyone that I get feedback from Space Power 23 is really excited about Space Power 24, and they're really happy that we put it on. So I'm looking forward to another great event.
Yeah, that's awesome, Bill. And I am too. I was blown away by last year, just surprised at every turn, and looking forward to more of the same this year. So will you come back on and tell us more about it as it gets a little closer?
Of course, happy to. In fact, that's coming up pretty quick. So happy to come on and provide a segment, if you will. Bruce, if you need some additional information, happy to share kind of ongoing, latest breaking news about that. And by the way, we're going to host it's an information session this week, and we're going to host another information session November 1st. And that is going to be Ronnie Smeedley, who is our event lead. She's going to be hosting that information session on November 1st. So if you're interested, go to our website, sign up for that information session, and that way you can really stay on top of exactly what's going on at Space Power 24.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Bill. I think we're going to wrap that up today. We'll let you get back to the rest of your day, but come find us again next month. We'll be at the first Friday of the month. It's 11 o'clock Mountain